All right. Earlier today, we took a short tour across the Himalayas. Now, how about a ride on the Darjeeling Express? That's the topic of the next subject. And your program would be Darjeeling Express of Food and Friendship. Our special speakers would be Asma Khan and Krishnendu in conversation with Shunali Khullar Shroff. How about we extend a warm round of applause for all the speakers today? And if I may call upon to the stage all of our speakers. And just to add, we'll also open the house to questions at 6 p.m. after this invigorating discussion.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming together right now at the end of the day. It's getting a little cold outside, so it's wonderful to see a room half full of people. Let me just introduce these lovely speakers to you today, and I have the absolute honor of having a conversation with them today about their respective works. So I'll begin with Asma. Asma Khan is a restaurateur. She runs a restaurant called Darjeeling Express, which has won quite a few food awards. It's a Michelin-starred restaurant. And Asma, actually, her journey began as an immigrant when she moved to the UK soon after her marriage. So she's not a trained chef. She's somebody who has learned to cook by turning to her family's age-old recipes handed down to her by her mother. She has Mughal ancestry, so that can explain the depth and the generational labyrinth of those recipes. And she shot into fame overnight after Netflix featured her on Chef's Table. She's the only British chef to have been featured on that show. No doubt it won you a lot of envy. So here we will talk to Asma today about her journey. Krishnendu is an academic affiliated with the New York University and a scholar of food studies. He's also an author. His second book is called The Ethnic Restaurateur, and this book examines the lived experiences, work, memories, struggles and challenges faced by immigrant restaurateurs in the US, and more specifically New York, is that correct? Okay, so we are talking today about food, community, and the entire immigrant experience. So I'd like to start with asking you both to start at the beginning about your respective journeys. Asma, tell everybody, how did it all start for you?
I moved to Cambridge in January, which is a really cold, damp month. And I moved from Calcutta, where, winter comes, kisses you, and goes away. There are 5 days when you feel cold. So I had no understanding of how, it can be cold. But there was also a coldness and emptiness as a person who lived in a very vibrant, loving household where I never ate a single meal on my own in Calcutta. I shared a room with my sister and assorted relatives who were booted off to stay in my room. Late at night, we'd get up and see there was someone else sleeping in the room, some aunt. This was normal, and so there was no, I didn't have this private space, this emptiness, this silence, and everybody would ask you, "Beta khana kaisa hai?" which is, how's the food? So there was always a discussion about food, and we always ended up talking about what we would eat the next meal, every meal time. And then I got married and moved to Cambridge, and that was so devastating. I moved in with a stranger, and I'm still married to him, so he's not a bad guy. I've been married for 28 years, and I think I'm still married to him. I think I should correctly say he's still married to me, because he's and you might find this funny as an academic, and I'm not saying this generally as academics. Let me put that caveat in. He doesn't have a lot of joy in his life, and he is, doesn't like to talk, doesn't like to eat, and doesn't want to talk to me. So he'd talk to his students, but he wouldn't talk to me. So I came in, and there was this silence and emptiness and hunger. I couldn't cook. And I married this very liberal person, very left-wing, very progressive, told my mother, I don't believe in gender roles. I will cook for her. She doesn't need to learn how to cook. And my God, what a bad cook he was. And he still is. And the rice he made was awful. So this whole immigrant journey for me was traumatic, because I felt bereft. I felt bereft of everything warm and comforting. I was perpetually hungry, because although I ate the chicken curry he would make, he would cook one day on Sunday. I had to eat the food the whole week. And he ate every meal in college, because he said, I have to look after my students. And he had to look after his students because he was graduate tutor that year. But he didn't feel he had to look after me. And I ate every meal alone, and it was incredibly hard. And I remember the first time I went out, I'm that pre-internet generation where we never saw a lot of visuals of any kind in India. There was only Doordarshan, which is a state television. So I'm that generation who left before, cable television. So I saw very few images of the West. And I touched the tree that had lost all its leaves. And that harshness in the bark, I still feel that harshness. Every time I hit a hurdle, I remember that, because I thought this tree was never going to have a spring. I was never going to have a spring. And stripped naked of everything beautiful, I stood there just like that tree in this barren, cold, so damp place. So I think that, the immigrant experience was just of that hollow tree, the roughness and the emptiness.
So before I move on to Krishnendu, to just complete this story, the first thing, you mentioned this to me when I actually met Asma the first time, full disclosure, when I went to the Darjeeling Express to have a meal with my mother, and she was actually waiting tables. It's an all-women kitchen. Women cook and only women serve, and none of these women are trained professional chefs. I think that has been Asma's main anthem in life. So we got chatting because she came to ask me if everything was all right. And by the end of that brief conversation, I wanted to know her better. And so I promptly wrote to a couple of publications I freelance for, and I said, would you like a story? And two wanted, and then there was a little tug of war between who would take it on the cover. So anyway, long story short, Asma said at that time that food has an emotional configuration. And you've both been immigrants. The first thing that you really miss is that connection with home, and food sort of bridges the gap between the country you've left behind and the country you've arrived at.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yes,
and you were missing that.
I missed that, because when I left India, I carried the wheat from my father's field, and I carried the soil from my mother's home in Calcutta. And I carried my mitti with me in some ways, the earth of my country. But when I went there and I couldn't cook, I really felt I was, this was for me hell. The Quran, they say there's burning fire and all kinds of things. No, hell is Cambridge in winter. And no food. And also food cooked by my husband. This is how hell should be written. Not what the Quran says. This is what it is. And all my beautiful bridal clothes. I come from a Nawab family. My mother had collected my clothes. The presumption was I'd marry another Nawab. No Nawab wanted to marry me. So I was married off to this academic in Cambridge with no warm clothes, with clothes like this. I had matching shoes. And I'll never forget that, all my shoes were hand-stitched to match my clothes. The first time I went out in Cambridge, it was so cold and wet, and it was very wet. I remember the person who stitched my shoes, matching the embroidery of my dupatta. He told me, you will look like Rani of Jhansi. when you go out. And in that water, my shoes started opening, and all the stitches came out, and the color started running. And I wanted to cry, but I said, no, I'm not going to cry, because he doesn't know this. He hasn't seen this has happened to his shoe. He was making a shoe for a princess who was going to have an arranged marriage. And there in that damp, as my shoe opened out in the wet, I was so happy that he wasn't there to see it. And that's what the whole story was, that, no one should know and no one should see. Because there was this thing that, everyone thought was so great. First of all, at 21, in my family to get married was like, you're so old. They were so relieved that, that some guy had married me. And that, everyone was so happy. And then, you're going to Cambridge, your husband's got a gold medal from Oxford in economics, he's so smart. All these things, how could I tell them that he was this non-communicating, joyless person? And he's still joyless, and he still doesn't talk to me. But it was just so hard. And so, and thank God.
He sounds like the suitable boy.
He was, and I'm slightly afraid saying all this next to an academic. But I'm not generally generalizing about academics.
He's enjoying the jokes.
And also Bengali. So combination of Bengali and academic is lethal. For those who know Bengalis, although there's a Bengali who's just won the Nobel Prize in economics, so there are, of course, those who do really well, and my husband is a very good economist, but he's not a great. Person who doesn't want to eat, doesn't want to talk to me. He's very different from me. People look at us and say, oh, you all are married. And I said, yes, this is not love marriage. I have to say that.
So, that's damn funny. Krishnendu, I wanted to ask you now. You wrote in your book that it is a force of circumstances that got you into the kitchen, and that you did think of cooking as something that a man raised in India wouldn't have to consider doing. As though cooking, I mean, he's been very, very candid. He says that Indian men are raised under this misconception that cooking is an inferior person's job. It's a being of superior intellect shouldn't have to enter the kitchen, especially if he's male. So could you tell us about how did you get into the kitchen?
Yeah, it's got a bit parallel with Asma's, and then of course kind of goes off in a different direction, but the theme is the same. Bengali academics are lethal, so let's accept that. And so my trajectory was similar politics, and I had done a lot of progressive politics in Delhi University, and then I went to the US to do my PhD. Of course, the first thing that hit me was nostalgia through food, and kind of a deeply embodied nostalgia. And that set off a chain kind of a thinking where, in fact, I had gone to do my PhD on questions of development and underdevelopment, and which is often classic, at least my generation, of scholars interested in progressive views. The question was, why is India underdeveloped, and how did that happen? And this particular university had a fantastic reputation of a bunch of scholars like Emanuel Wallerstein, James Petrus, Mark Selden, who were interested in this whole question of how the underdeveloped world was, in fact, underdeveloped rather than left behind. But while I had gone there to study these questions, the nostalgia came to me through this embodied sense of loss. But even more kind of substantively changing was this question of, I had grown up by that point of time, 20-some years in India, and had never thought about cooking and had never cooked. That I could be a 20-something male and not have ever cooked or thought about it, in spite of my progressive politics, was totally an absurd kind of a proposition. And so I went to my advisor and I said, I think I'm going to change my topic and start looking at immigrants and how they have dealt with this question of loss of access to this very embodied memory, and I'll do a comparative study of Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, and Indian immigrants. So that was the first set of kind of a provocation that led me to my work on food and which I see today as the question of care and caregiving, and which is central to the question, I think, the crisis we face in terms of questions of sustainability, in questions of care work. The second set that was built on it, subsequently, I was married, I had a child, and this is kind of a bit of a complex story I had to take care of the child because of serious mental illness of my ex-wife, and about 6 months old, since 6 months old, and he's right now in college, for about 18 years now, I have raised him. So that was the second set of questions, that was, can I be not only cook for myself? So when I talk to my male friends and you critique them for not cooking, they will often say, no, I make my chai, I cook meat curry once on Sunday, but they never think about cooking for other people. They'll say, I'm independent because I can cook for myself, okay? So my 6-month-old son, and subsequently until he was 18 years old, posed me the question, which is, can I become the primary caregiver? So I eventually became the primary caregiver, and as I've said before, I learned to cook by, in fact, failing to cook. I talked to my mother. By the way, that's exactly how my mother learned to cook. She got married into a family with 13 siblings. She was married to one of them, and she had to take care of all the rest of them. She didn't know how to cook, and she got married into the family, and she was reprimanded by her mother-in-law for not being a cook, and she struggled to replicate her mother-in-law's recipes, and in failing to do so, produced her own repertoire, and she has become the best cook ever now, of course, after 50 years of cooking. Similarly, I, in fact, became a cook and started thinking and writing about cooking precisely by, in fact, first recognizing that I had failed to do so, and then second, in trying to replicate my mother's recipes and failing to do so, I have developed my own repertoire, and I in fact think that is how most people cook and learn to cook and become cooks. In fact, not by being successful in replicating, by in fact failing to replicate, and in doing that, generating their repertoire. And that's kind of, in some ways, in short, trying to cut out too much melodrama out of the story, otherwise it'll kind of be a Bollywood melodrama, is now I see, and my son for the last week was at home by himself in Manhattan and cooking for him every meal, every day, and he would send me pictures on WhatsApp and talk about what was working well and what didn't work well, how things were undersalted, and it's a beautiful perspective to see him learn how to cook by failing to cook like me.
So food, Krishnendu and Asma, is actually such an important part of our culture. Indians especially, get intimate with each other over food, and that reminds me to something that you said in your book, that food is a good way to get intimate, and it often is a precursor to a physical intimacy with a person. And then you said, of course, I don't suggest that everybody go to dinner and then sleep with each other, yes. But it definitely is something that, without bothering to get that intimate with somebody, you can break bread with them and really get to know them better. When food is so sacrosanct and so important to our, not just for sustenance, but even for our inner well-being, why do you think, Asma, that cooking was looked upon as an inferior pursuit in our culture?
The biggest thing is that it was women who cooked. It is, and never paid, never applauded, and never ever seen as skilled. So the thing is that, it is always seen as an inferior, that my own grandmother, who was not very literate, would tell me that beta main anpad hu, I can't really read and write, but the fact that she made this amazing, chicken, and she could do these beautiful kormas, because she felt it was worth nothing, it was undervalued because it was the woman who undervalued herself. And the thing is that I think that's where the problem started, because for generations, women were always seen as, The provider, yes, you fed people.
Invisible
And
provider.
the thing is that, in most families, women didn't even sit on the table. So the joy that, my beautiful dal that I have cooked for, and dal ko ghot ke, I've absolutely, by hand, I have crushed the dal, and I've done the baghar and sent it. I will only see the, as we call the jhuta plates that come back. The smudges of dal on the plate, the leftover at the bottom of the plate. So not only were the women undervalued, they didn't even have that pleasure, which I now need. I need to see my clients in my restaurant eating. I serve the tables not because, I'm anxious that something's going wrong. I step back and I watch that look in their eyes when they break into the chicken puri kebab. That look, that is my sense that this is what I cook for. I cook to see someone else eat. And I think that women are not only not respected or honored or paid in any way. वैसे तो, women are not paid for 99% of the things we do, but they also were not ever given that pleasure that you sit at the end of your table. You will, of course, not eat, but you will watch your family eat. You will watch them make eye contact with you. And even if they don't tell you how lovely it is, you see it in their eyes. Even that was taken away from us. We cooked behind walls. And the thing is that, because of that bruising memory of the dirty plates coming back to the women and the half-empty bowls, the shorva, the only gravy left, maybe 1 or 2 pieces of bone coming back, the botis, the big pieces of meat, all gone. The wing of a chicken or the little pieces coming back. Never the prize bits coming back. And I used to always wonder, I used to just be disappointed that, there's not a nice piece. Even I didn't think at that time, why did they not leave for us? Why did they not leave the nice bits for us? And I think that, it cost me £40,000, which I didn't have. I struggled to put up an open kitchen because, Indian food, there's a lot of smoke and spices or whatever. It's a small restaurant. Those some who have been there will know this. You know this as well. The smells don't come out of the cooking because I bought the most expensive extractor. And then, of course, my extractor comes out on Carnaby Street, where everyone thinks they live in the Ritz. So it had to be higher than the highest building. And I did that. I spent the money when I didn't have that money, and it hurt so much. A lot of the stuff I had to physically do myself. I cleaned the restaurant for 5 days, just me and one person. Couldn't afford to get the builders to clean it. My budget had completely finished. But I wanted those women to be visible. I wanted people to see the hands of the women who cooked. I wanted them to see the people eating their food. And the first time, Uma, who's, our oldest cook, she's 62, she's a dadi and a nani, she was telling me, I didn't know that you can feel this way. She was in tears. My heart broke. She has spared 3 generations. And she stood there weeping at the pass, watching people eat food that she had made. She had made the aloo ka sabzi, and they were eating it. And Uma was watching and weeping. How humbling is that? And this is why, I need to do what I'm doing. This is not about me. This is never about me. It's these women who never got recognized. I speak in their voice because they never even realized, like I never realized, how wrong it was.
Very, very beautifully said. And I know Asma, she means it from her heart, really. Krishnendu, moving on to a lighter subject. You mentioned in your book that cooking won you a lot of allies. You became popular overnight in grad school, and people began to come forward and help you with your assignments. Tell us a little about that, anecdotally.
Yeah, good. And I'm going to also get in. First, can I take a picture so I can send it to my mom? That she's surprised that I can make a living talking about food. And so...
Should I take your picture?
No, this is good.
It's a room full of people now.
It's a room full of people, so I have to send it to her. She says, wow, I can't believe Americans are paying you all this money to talk about Indian food that you didn't know how to cook. So the first thing, I'm going to go back to your previous question. I think a bit, Asma is absolutely right. It is about gender and it is about class. And I think it's also more than that. It is about what I call grandiose transcendentalism. any culture, any philosophy that thinks of high-mindedness too highly does not pay enough attention to the work that goes into making life possible. Okay? And that is both in the West and in the East. The grandiose high-mindedness is, in fact, the enemy of everyday caregiving at the heart of it. And you can see that in not only in Indian philosophy, the problems of it, and you see its reflections in caste. You also see it in Western philosophy, post-Descartes, and with Immanuel Kant. I mean, think about Descartes, the Cartesian logic, right? Which is the idea that I think, therefore I am. In fact, the real retort to that is I eat, therefore I am. Okay? So this distance from bodily needs is in fact the primary problem that creates this idea that people who really take care of our everyday needs are somehow intellectually, aesthetically inferior. That is an absurd, wrong direction in which both Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy has taken, okay? And in some ways, what I like about this moment is the return of something so obvious, so embodied, so central to caregiving, and so, in that sense, transformative in a microscopic way, like me taking care of my child, that should be crucial to both our doing and our thinking. Now, the other side of it, which is your second question, which is this is also, it is not just a burden, it is not just work, it is not just labor, it is also a deep sense of pleasure. I don't think I would have recognized how pleasurable it was to be a father, how pleasurable it is to be a father, if I had not wiped his ass, kind of cleaned up his puke, because the first few months, what the child does is basically eat and puke and burp, okay? And love him in spite of that. I would say, as a traditional male, I would have lost out on that bodily proximity, okay, with my son, that mothers have a natural access to. Okay? And I remember him putting him in the bathtub in hot water, and that would relax his muscles, so he would go poop in the bathtub, and then I had to go chasing his poop because I didn't want to waste all that water. That is a particular kind of a relationship, embodied, deeply embodied relationship about caregiving. That is the tragic side of masculinity, is lost in fact. The other side of it is the deep pleasure of care, and the question you pose, in my grad school, for instance, most of us were radical men who talked radicalism but didn't know how to take care of anyone's life at all, okay? So this was the process in which was a great transformation of our everyday cooking, and we cooked terribly. In fact, to give you an example, American chickens are big and fatty, okay? So, but in our heads, we had, well, big hunks of meat was a sign of having arrived, and we wanted to make tandoori chicken. So we put all this pink paste on these big fat chickens and put them on the over the burner. And of course, what happens is all that fat then drips in, burns the chicken on the outside, and does not cook it inside. Okay, so the first few times was all really crappy, burnt chicken, okay? And that was the cooking we thought was cooking, okay? Dal and rice are a little more forgiving, okay? And so slowly, again, this failure to do what we wanted to do was the process by which we learned to take care of each other. And I lived in an apartment in which there were 5 of us, and all of us were from different parts of the world. One was a Lebanese student, one was a Jordanian student, one was a Pakistani student. I had never met a Pakistani in my life, though they are our neighbors. One was an Afghan student, and we cooked with each other. We fed each other miserably initially, eventually learning how to feed each other well and take care of each other. That was the pleasurable side of it, along with the caregiving side of it.
And Asma told me that, we'll have to fast forward this a bit to the time when Asma finally came back to India and told her mother, I do not want to go back to England, and because she was really hungry. Is that right?
Yes, because, and in the kind of family I come from, to tell anyone you don't want to go back is a huge scandal, because then, of course, it's not just that you coming back, leaving your husband is a huge disgrace. Nobody else would get any of their girls married off. They fear that because, you have a bad reputation because you returned. And so, yeah, no, I threatened. So the good thing was that once I realized that my mother will teach me how to cook, I started learning how to cook with Ammu and Haji Sahab, my family cook. I told my aunt, who is, from the Nizam family, who guarded the recipes with her life, but she had a daughter my age. I said, I will come back and no one will marry her. And that was it. So I got all the beautiful Hyderabadi recipes. So apart from her, I can cook. I'm the only one who can cook all the halim and the dalchas and the Hyderabadi, baghara bega and everything. I cook like her. She taught me so I could get it perfect. Because she was like, nahi, you have to stay. Because it'll be such a scandal. I was thinking, koi faras shadi nahi karega. That was it. So yeah, I was a bit manipulative on that front. But everyone whose recipe I wanted, some of my aunts are terrible cooks. So I picked the ones who I could touch and tweak a bit. And I got all the recipes. Yeah, then I learned very fast because I grew up in the kitchen with my mother hanging around there. So I learned very quickly.
But you also said this to me in that interview that I did with you, that when you came back to England, it was homesickness that drove you to cooking in a way. And when you came back to England, and every time you cooked, you felt your mother was standing next to you.
Yeah, I felt...
That was such a moving thought.
It was that, I felt Ammu was next to me. Because as I bhunod the masalas, and I made korma or rizala or the biryani, and I was close to kind of closing it, literally I felt on my skin her aanchal. It was that kind of feeling. I felt her presence all the time. And I really, really suffered lack of affection and love. And I put that into the food. And even though my husband never said anything when he ate my food, ever, he still doesn't do it.
He keeps making an appearance in these conversations,
no,
and I wait for those bits, actually.
No, but he never responded. But then I made friends. I found people who I could feed, students. And, and that would give me so much joy. And then I realized that, my food is good. Because, when there was zero response from the professor, I realized that, there might be other people who will like the food. And this is how I made friends. I'm still friends with them. And it was a healing process. It was a process where I realized that, this is my calling. And I will use food. And I knew that even before I started my law degree and before I did my PhD in law. I knew then my destiny, this is my calling, because somebody who bought my samosa told me, Allah has gifted your hands. This is where you will make the magic, by cooking. And at that time, I just about learned how to make samosas. I mean, the Bengali shingara. No, I shouldn't call it samosa. Bengali shingara is far superior. So, I'd made, yeah. So it was that, but this whole idea that, yes, I'm someone gifted. Strangers told me that, and I believed them. Not the words, I saw it in their eyes. And that made a huge difference to me.
I would say, in some ways, the Bengali male academics' point of view was, in fact, part of it was to get away from the aanchal of my mother. Because as we all know, South Asian men, and especially Bengali men, never really grow up. And so there's kind of this astonishing lack of autonomy. And to develop that sense of autonomy and take pride on it, that's a bit of my Americanization, of course. And also I see that is partly to both depend on my mother, but not so dependent on her that I had been 20-some years, that she had become invisible. Her labor had become invisible, And so in some ways, I had to redefine myself. And even now, I mean, that's the picture I took. My mom is convinced that this is not the right masculine way of doing a profession. okay, on one side of it.
Poverty.
Yes, and then she's also touched by the idea. She is the one. I get into the kitchen, sit down. I took some beautiful pictures of her working on the boti, the Bengali. My mother is Odia, but adopted in some ways into a Bengali. My father is Bengali, my mother is Odia. And my culture in that sense is Odia and Bengali. We are Provashi Bengalis, so we are like in some ways Bengalis outside of Bengal. Part of it is also we cannot stomach too much Bengaliness, especially the Kolkata Bengaliness. So we like to stay away from it a bit. And part of this culture is this idea of becoming an autonomous person without being excessively dependent on what I call the servant-wife complex of cookery. Okay, that is presumed to be how you feed yourself. And so that has been a real fun and an adventure and very unconvincing now to my parents still.
You know, there's this old joke about Jesus Christ being Bengali because he spent his life living with his mother. He believed his mother was a virgin, and mother thought son was God.
Exactly. Exactly.
So anyway, moving on to something slightly more serious, you say in the book Krishnendu, you quote Hindu and Vedic scriptures, highlighting the differences between a Western outlook towards food and an Asian approach to the act of cooking. You look at it, I mean, you say that our scriptures look at it indeed as a deeply meaningful spiritual pursuit. Could we talk a little about that from the scriptural point of view?
Yeah, so in some ways, the one example I gave you before is the Cartesian. I think that is the big divide in Western philosophy. Is before the Cartesian divide, if you go to early modern Europe, there's a sense in which food festivals are part of fine arts. And in fact, part of courtly cuisine. In fact, that begins to drop out of European philosophy, European thinking, and it is something in the Kantian philosophy, it gets developed as, because food is so proximate, because taste is so subjective, because taste is so personal, in fact, we cannot have rational disputation about it. And because we cannot have rational disputation about it, it cannot be in some ways the fine arts. So the fine arts are the arts in which are visible to our eye, painting, architecture, or the ear, which is sound, okay? And in fact, anything else that is about touch, about smell, about what's in your mouth, it's too subjective, too proximate, too much full of sentiment to be amenable to rational discourse. That is the basis on which Immanuel Kant eventually excludes food from the high arts and a finer senses, okay? And in fact reduces food to something inferior, mundane, and everyday. That, in a sense, never happened as fully in Eastern philosophies, but in Eastern philosophy, there's also been, especially in Brahmanic transcendentalism, you see that the whole caste system is structured around the idea that anybody who does manual work is in some ways inferior to very refined thinking, highest level of thinking. So the two, in some ways, forms of, by the way, if you think about it, if you look at these philosophers, they are mostly men, and that is not coincidental. Okay? And this is an ideology of largely upper class and upper caste men in theorizing about what is valuable. Okay? In spite of that, in some forms of Indic aesthetic theory, especially rasa aesthetic, we have a sense that food and emotion and aesthetics should not be judged just on the base of reason, which is the Kantian argumentation. It should be, in fact, based on emotion, not on subjectivity, but in fact on intersubjectivity, which is what we call the rasa aesthetic. The best part of rasa aesthetic is that you share, you cook, you talk to each other, or in some ways in a qawwali or in a poetry competition, in the way the audience joins in and says, wah, 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 is a way of, in some ways, involving intersubjectively deciding, because after all, what is good taste? good taste is what we intersubjectively decide is agreeable to us and for under what conditions, under what rules. So in some ways, rasa aesthetic, which is, I consider it Indic aesthetic, brings in emotion and reason and intersubjectivity in the discussion about good taste. And my sense is this high-minded transcendentalism is collapsing both in the West and the East, and provides us an opportunity to what has been considered inferior, subaltern, things serious men do not think about are coming barging into this world. So you can have a room full of people talking about literature who can take food seriously, finally.
Thank God for that. So Asma got herself a degree in British constitutional law, but all along she knew that the only thing she wanted to do was to cook, and more than cook, to serve and nourish people. And she started very slyly doing supper clubs at her house every time her husband traveled. This was never disclosed to him. And I want to talk a little bit about that. How did that work out for you? And how did he like people walking all over his carpets? I know.
The thing is that I knew that he would never, even if he met someone on the road, he wouldn't talk to them. So he would never know. So there's the thing with Mushtaq is that I knew for sure. He saw a friend of mine, he'd cross the road and hide and pretend he didn't recognize her. So there was zero risk of him ever finding out. He's not on social media. The strength of the man is that he's not hovering over me. His progressive, his radical political views was that, I let you free. We are partners, but we're equal. And this was actually what I took advantage of, which is that I knew that he would never ever hover over me, never check on me. And for those who have got partners like that, you'll are very lucky. Much as I moan about the lack of affection and love, that comes at a price, which is that he's going to check your phone, see all your pictures.
Indian men specialize in that.
No, yeah, and yeah.
They have a PhD in that.
Yeah, so the thing is that I hid behind his back. In the beginning, it was just a coincidence. I didn't tell him. I thought I might tell him. But then I realized, why I should lie? It'll be fine. He'll never know. And he never knew. I did it for years, and he never found out. So no harm done. I wasn't damaging anything in his house. And I didn't let anyone go into his study.
Just like 20, 30 people walking over his furniture and carpets every other weekend.
But nobody went into his study. His study was his temple. I closed it, and no one went into his study, and that was it. So there was a glass door, and everyone would peep into his study and say, that's the professor's study. But I terrified him, and I ruined his reputation with everyone. I said, yeah, he's really kind of joyless person, doesn't like food. So they all thought I was married to some crazy guy. So there was no risk that anyone would ever talk to him. So that was it. And yeah, it worked really well.
But what cuisines were you cooking at that time? Just your Mughlai?
Yeah, I was cooking Mughlai food. I was cooking food, mainly all our dawats, from our wedding feasts to Eid, Bakr Eid food. So really all the kind of feasts that we used to have. But also I used to cook in Ramzan, so we used to have iftar. So I did all the things that I missed. For those who have actually sat down and broken a fast in iftar, which is ironic because you're fasting and it's a religious month, but the table groans with food, which is so unique. So I recreated the feasts of my home. So it was like I used to make 16 dishes, and everything was served in the way that would be served in my house. And that gave me joy because I knew what would go with everything. So, if we made nargasi kofta, we made a particular thing that went with it. So we served kosha mangsho with luchi. Because the combinations, I didn't want to risk that somebody would choose from an a la carte menu. I gave them everything the way they were supposed to eat it. And if someone was making a mistake, I said, no, you don't eat this way, you eat it that way. This is also a Bengali obsession. I'm half Bengali. But this whole thing of the way that you eat, it's a journey. For me, it was really, I was taking someone, I was embracing them. Actually, cooking is a very intimate thing. Your hands, my fingerprints are unique. Even the dough that I need is the dough that will not taste like what anyone else will need, that dough. Because I touched it, I've made it. And then it's a way of embracing. Someone will eat that food, I will watch it. It is so intimate It is so, there is that bridge, there is that moment when the food I have cooked, you have eaten. For that moment, we are one in some ways that is so powerful as well. And you know, for someone like me who remembers what it was to be alone, I was building a community, but I was feeding a community. And this, for me, was my victory. I felt I had overcome. I had won over all these depressing hurdles that I'd hit. And I realized one thing, that now I can dream. I can dream of something bigger. It wasn't a restaurant, but I dreamt of feeding more people. I dreamt of talking to more people. I dreamt of somewhere having an audience. Little did I know I would end up like this, where I'd been. I mean, I just wanted people to respect and honor women who cooked. I wanted to talk to them. If I couldn't feed them, I wanted to tell them the story. I just wanted for them to understand so that I could reach out to them in any way I could, if I couldn't cook for them. To please, when you sit next to a woman who looks like me, honor her, respect her, look her in the eye, because she is this gifted person, but the person who's never been paid, never been honored, never been given the respect, undervalued the day she was born as a child, and harder when you're a second daughter. From that moment, when there is this amazing sense of depression, because you're not the son that everyone's waiting for, till every meal of yours, there's no appreciation. You just come back with empty plates, with just smattering of food that you cooked so lovingly. It's very tough to be a woman and not to feel that pain. But I feel it now, but I know that my mother never felt it, because she thinks this is how it is.
So she's not just a mistress of spices, she's also a philosopher, as you can see. And you know, when Asma opened her restaurant, instead of opening it with a big bang launch calling all the who's who of central London, she opened it up to students and poor people who were fasting during Ramadan, so they could come and eat a meal for free. And I think that is an amazing gesture. That's really called walking the talk.
It was important for me because, you know, this is very much part of the Indian tradition of all cultures, that it's auspicious to feed the hungry. You must start with an auspicious good step. So I thought that, you know, I want to be successful. Let me feed the hungry and let me feed the poor. And, you know, I don't care whether you have an addiction, why you're hungry. I'll feed them all. Let me start by giving my food. And, you know, and I hope that du'as in some ways will bring blessings to my restaurant. And then we start by, you know, feeding us. I didn't want to call journalists and bloggers and whatever they would write. I felt that appreciation of someone who was hungry would be more powerful for me. It had more symbolism for me.
So Krishnendu, you talk about Rasool, the Pakistani restaurateur, who actually didn't really know how to cook really well. At home, his wife cooks for him. And he was servicing the lower end of the food chain in the New York restaurant scene. He takes care of, taxi drivers. And then you have Chitrita Mukherjee, who opens a fancy vada pav, Bombay street food store that doesn't survive very long. So could you just take us through why one thing works over the other, whereas the passion is missing in the first case?
To make you guys happy, I think they want to go to the questions now, right? So I'm going to give a very short answer, which is this. In some ways, the New York City market and also the London market is very segmented in a particular way, and what I call a hierarchy of taste, which is, say, there are about 400 restaurants in New York, Indian restaurants in New York City. There are 24,000 restaurants in New York City, out of which 400 are Indian restaurants, out of which about 390 are basically, you cannot charge more than $12 to $15 for a meal. Okay, and you can imagine what that does to a restaurant with kind of rents like New York City. On the other side, only about 2% of New York City Indian restaurants are upscale restaurants. And so there is a hierarchy of taste. There's a problem in terms of demand where Americans, and I think, the situation is slightly different in London. Americans are not yet willing to pay good money for good Indian food as they're willing for French, Italian, Japanese, and increasingly Korean and Greek, for instance. Indian, Thai, Mexican, with some exceptions, is still trapped at the bottom end of the market. And I'll finish it by saying in London, in fact, Indian food is a lot like Italian food in New York City. It has a wider range, a wider spectrum, and in fact, people are willing to pay very high price to mid-market and, of course, lower end of the way they get the cheap chicken tikka masala, etc. So it's partly a demand side, and I've written a whole book on it. If you're really interested in that question, you should read The Ethnic Restaurateur. Let me stop there. Yep.
So I think we have 5 minutes.
10 minutes
for the audience questions. Okay. Could I possibly just ask Asma about her views on fusion cooking, because it came up in a previous conversation today, and I think that is an interesting point of view. I'd hear from both of them very briefly. Fusion cooking, what is your point of view about that?
I personally don't like it, and I know that it's very popular, and it also makes Indian food more accessible. And the thing is that for me, the dumbing down of Indian food, the fact that you've added truffle oil to something, and you've added wasabi and a spin oil, and then, Indian small plates are called Indian tapas. It's not nationalism, it's not patriotism, it just makes me uncomfortable that, how is it that we have been unable to communicate centuries of food, and suddenly we're twisting it in this kind of different kind of cuisine and presenting as Indian fusion, when I think that is such a sad thing, because we haven't actually celebrated our food. It's a celebration of our identity, of who we are. And I have no issues with people who are doing very successful fusion food. Good on them. I wouldn't do it, because for me, I want to introduce you to the food that makes me tick, that takes my breath away, and that's never fusion food.
Does that resonate with you as well?
I'm just going to, in fact, I'm not going to step into it. I'm just going to quote Madhur Jaffrey at the other panel. She says, contrary to Asma, for instance, is that everything has been fusion anyway all along. So let me just stop there as 2 points of view on it. Yep.
So we'll take audience questions now. Please just introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Hi, my name is Shalaka. My question to you is, when you started off cooking, is there a reduced sense of inhibition when it comes to coming up with new dishes per se? I mean, you spoke about replicating recipes and, therein developing your own style. But how is it any different when you want to come up with something entirely new? So if you could run us a little through that.
Well, Asma is a better chef than I'm a kind of a moderately good cook. I cook about 5 days a week. My sense is, honestly, there's nothing that new in the world. So everything, there's a bridge to it, and it's kind of analogs you build, and you fail to bridge it, and then you try to, in some ways, I'll give you an example. I have never baked anything, and my son is beginning to beat me, and he's beginning to bake, and he learns it from his mom, who's away, and then he's kind of sneaking that back into the kitchen, but he's building that bridge through his mom's repertoire, and that's a bridge I was not ready to cross. So my sense is, in everyday life, there are not too many radically new things in general, but that's my experience.
Yes, please. I think we need a mic here.
Thank you so much. My question's for you, sir. I'm actually working on a thesis that tries to understand gender and food work on Indian television, right? And as I understand it, conventionally masculinity is shown to be alien to like the everyday drudgery of cooking, etc. And it's shown to be a thing of leisure and pleasure for a man, right? I want to know how you personally sort of renegotiated and translated the performative act of cooking into a masculinity that isn't sort of heteronormative or alienated from the everyday?
I think in some ways, like a lot of things in everyday life, I think it was pragmatism. I had to take care of another life. I had to do, and I was forced to do it. So in a sense, that's why I want to kind of disabuse people of the idea that there's some kind of a grandiose act of rejecting my masculinity. No, not at all. It was in some ways failure of dependence on free feminine labor that forced me to work it. So people who have power don't give up power by their goodwill and their great intention. I was forced to do it because there was no free labor at home, which tends to be female gendered. Okay, so I ended up in some ways working. So initially full of resentment. By the way, it's not like I loved all this new work I had to do now. I was full of resentment, but then I had to talk myself. Said this kid came into the world, and I had to support him. So in spite of resentment, get off your ass and act on it, and it forced me.
I just want to add one thing that but look at what's happening in restaurants full of men. That's because they're being paid. There's a huge difference. So suddenly then it no longer becomes a female thing. It no longer becomes effeminate. It no longer becomes drudgery because they're paid. So it says a lot about what has happened. So the problem is the lack of pay and respect. And the moment there is money, of course, his story is, he just said, he slightly resented it, then he got on with it. He had no choice. But suddenly men are queuing up. If they can get on television and be on MasterChef, they will be there. They're cooking if they get paid. And that is really sad. Why are they not cooking for the people they love? But this is the whole attitude, and this is really wrong.
And just a factual note on that. Asma is right. Oxfam just came out with a report that there's 12.5 billion hours per day of unpaid care work, all of that gendered female in the world. And it's the social structure that produces that, and it in some ways, different ways of trying to circumvent it and transform it. And some of it is going to be by refusing to do that work so that others have to do the work.
I think, we can take one last question, and maybe two if they are brief. The lady in the front was asking for the mic.
Good evening. My question's to you, ma'am. What do you think about the seepage of veganism into typical Indian recipes? As in, I remember coming across dishes such as vegan butter paneer and stuff like that. What is your stance or what is your opinion of it?
Not a very good opinion. Because I think that, I come from Bengal, where we don't have cream and butter and things. This is very Punjabi. People think we put ghee and butter in everything. We don't. So we already have naturally vegan stuff, so much of it. Most of Bengali, vegetarian cooking has got no dairy in it. A lot of because of the heat of this country. So I think just putting artificial and making things up, because if there was no vegan dish, so I can understand why the West is struggling. Because, they have to have burgers and then they come up with all these kind of ridiculous things. What is our problem? I don't understand. Because we have so many vegan dishes, and the whole thing is everything is vegan. Don't put ghee. Who puts ghee in their food? Tell me every day. No one does. Everyone uses oil. So I don't understand this big obsession. Why are we letting the Western rhetoric affect us? It completely unnecessary. I'm glad you asked me the question.
Would you like to ask a question now? Yeah.
We've got one more question.
Yeah, right here. That's the last question, yeah.
Thank you very much for asking. I realized once I opened the restaurant that food could be used to heal people, food could be used to create communities. And yes, I went to Iraq and I opened an all-female cafe, like my own restaurant in Darjeeling Express, in Essian camp for Yazidi girls who had been picked up by ISIS men and used as sex slaves. And I am now going to go to the Rohingya camp. I'm setting up a shingara and chai shop. And my aim is finally to take the Darjeeling Express home to Calcutta, to Shialda, to open a shop where I can actually get girls from, who are from the red light area, young girls who know that they can sell food but not sell their body. Because there is no option. I want them to know that food can be your way out. Look at me. Look at all the women in my kitchen. There are 25 of us. We broke the chains of patriarchy by liberating ourselves, and I want to do that, and thank you for asking. Thank you.
Patriarchy and racism.
Yeah,
Both.
absolutely.
We have 2 more minutes, and may I use these 2 minutes? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Jitesh Madhwani. My question is that generally, if we look at restaurant food, for example, a steak or a meatloaf or a lasagna, that's something which could be made at home and had in restaurants. Whereas with Indian cuisine, generally what we get in restaurants is not what we would cook at home. Why that difference?
Can I ask regarding to home cooking? The one thing is that because most of the cooking in restaurants being done by men who don't know how to cook like home. That's actually the real answer.
In fact, and there's very good work on it, on how, in fact, the only cuisine in the world I would say that successfully does that is French haute cuisine. And it is linked to masculinization of a profession. Just like, by the way, it's not only happening with cooking, it also happened with healthcare, with midwifery and modern medicine. There's that transition. When an occupation gets professionalized, the first thing that happens is masculinization of it, and to exclude people who genuinely, habitually have done it. So all the OBGYNs were men, and often they laid women on their backs to give birth because men obviously don't know how to give birth. Laying on your back to give birth is the worst way to give birth, okay? So science, in one way, it goes take one step forward, but with it also there is a professionalization with which you have a masculinization, with which you also have a loss of a certain kind of intuitive knowledge that resides in communities of practice.
Okay, we are just winding up. I've requested them to show a few photographs of, just a few seconds. There are some pictures of Asma at the Yazidi camp, the cafe that she started. Can we just have a look at that, please? Oh, okay. I see. Okay. Anyway, you were all a wonderful audience, and thank you so much, Krishnendu and Asma. This could have been a longer discussion because I have about 20 more questions, but everybody's got to go home. So thank you so much.
This is my team, and which is, so we have people of different cultures, so it is beyond only Indian women. This is in my own kitchen, and so, we've got someone from Ghana, we've got someone from Nepal, and I think that, wherever there's patriarchy, our stories are all the same. And I am using the restaurant to break down the walls between us, because this is how we will win, and we will defeat patriarchy, when women strengthen and actually link up with each other. Because it's the only way we'll win, because otherwise you're not going to be able to beat the system.
On this delicious note, how about we honor our guests with the festival scarves? I request our volunteer. Can we accompany this with a great warm round of applause and a delicious one at that, please? And Asa would also be at the author's signing tent. That's when you step out. That's to your left, right at the end. She'll happily sign your books. Yes, absolutely. In the meantime, we've found a misplaced pair of spectacles. If it's anybody's, you can pick it up from me, or I'll leave it at the information desk.